My name is Dr. Helen Rappaport. I have an honorary doctorate from Leeds University, where I studied Russian. I'm also a fellow of the Royal Historical Society, and I specialize in Russian history, particularly late imperial Russia, the final years of the imperial family, and also in the Victorian era, the reign of Queen Victoria. So I've written extensively on the Romanov family and the impact of hemophilia on the family with regard to Alexei, the Tsarevich of Russia, who with his parents was murdered in 1918 in Yekaterinburg. I got interested in them quite late, really. I was always a lover of Russian history, but I never thought particularly about the royals and the aristocracy until about 2006, 2007, when an agent I was then with suggested I write something about the Romanov family. It hadn't particularly interested me because I wasn't really into bling and royals and palaces and all that stuff. But when I started looking at the Romanov family, I became very interested in the dynamic of their family life. And in particular, I guess, about how they coped with having a hemophiliac son and having to hide that fact from public view. Hemophilia is very particular to Alexei in terms of the Romanovs, because there hadn't been any hemophilia in the Russian royal family until Alexei was born in 1904. And the hemophilia, sadly, had been brought into the Russian royal family by his mother, Alexandra of Hesse, because her family, the Hesse family, had hemophilia transmitted to them via her mother, Princess Alice, who was the daughter of Queen Victoria. So hemophilia came down to the Russian royal family via the German Hesse family. In terms of the Romanov family, the most common misconception is that it was several weeks after Alexei was born in August 1914 that the family discovered he was a hemophiliac. In fact, his mother, Alexandra, had lived in utter terror and dread of giving birth to a male child who would have hemophilia passed on to him. So when she gave birth to a boy after 4 daughters, it was no surprise, I guess, to her and Nicholas that their worst fears came true within hours of Alexei being born, because he started bleeding from the navel. But all the history books, until I did my research, pretty much said, oh, it wasn't until, I don't know, September, October, a couple of months later. But in fact, I found evidence within family letters and that, in fact, the baby started bleeding from the navel almost as soon as he was born. And the reason this happened, apparently, was because there's a tradition in Russian midwifery. When a child's born, and I think they still do it now, they swaddle the babies very tightly up like little packages. And the swaddling on Alexei had been so tight that it had pressed on his navel and caused bleeding at the recently cut umbilical cord. So they knew straight away, these horrible telltale marks, the spattering of blood, that this might be the one thing they'd lived in dread of, which was the Coburg disease, the Hesse disease. In fact, it was often called the Coburg curse because of the way it had come down from through the German side of the family. The minute Alexei was born and they saw that he had the bleeding disease, this dreaded bleeding disease, there was a total clampdown. They had to protect him, first of all, from any injury or accident that would cause bleeding, but also in the wider sense, it had to be a state secret. Because in Russia, for the heir to the throne, as Alexei was, because it went through the male line, he could not be perceived as being in any way a cripple, in any way dysfunctional, because he had a life-threatening condition. So it was an absolute state secret that Alexei had the condition. And Nicholas and Alexandra managed to keep it secret pretty much until 1912, when Alexei had a very, very serious attack of bleeding and almost died. In 1904, hemophilia was very little understood. The science wasn't understood. Very little had even been written about it. It was a puzzle. They didn't understand the science. There was certainly no treatment whatsoever for a hemophiliac apart from lying them down, keeping them quiet, and applying ice. In 1910, of course, one thing that unfortunately was wrongly considered as being helpful because it eased pain was aspirin. And one of the worst things, of course, you could do is give anyone with hemophilia aspirin because, it thins the blood. So initially, Alexei had been given aspirin. It was Rasputin who told the parents immediately to stop giving him aspirin because that would only make things worse. Alexandra was in denial that it might come through to her because they didn't really understand the transmission of the disease, but she must have had it in the back of her mind, going through every single pregnancy until the child was born. And in the case, the first 4 children, they were all daughters, and she heaved a sigh of relief. But when Alexei was born, she must have lived with a most terrible, suppressed sense of denial, anxiety, dread, you name it, because I think the most interesting thing about hemophilia in the Russian royal family, of course, is that, first of all, Alexei had type B hemophilia, which was not as bad as type A. He had what they call Christmas disease. So today it would have been perfectly treatable and he would have survived and probably had a happy life. But at the time, Nicholas himself, in private conversation with the doctors, was told he'd be lucky to see the age of 16. If Alexei had not been born a hemophiliac, if he'd been a normal, healthy child, there wouldn't have been this need for secrecy. The Russian throne wouldn't have been threatened because Alexandra wouldn't have embraced the help and support of Rasputin, who was hated and demonized. And in many ways, Alexei's hemophilia set the ball rolling for the fall of the monarchy because Alexandra was so hated. And once she took on board Rasputin as a friend and advisor, the chips were down because so many people in Russia hated them both and thought they were conniving and that they were spies. And so things could have been very, very different if Alexei had not been a hemophiliac child. And certainly in terms of other royal families, hemophilia was passed down completely unwittingly by Queen Victoria because it was passed down through her daughter Alice to Alexandra, and also to Alexandra's sister Irene, who married the Prince of Prussia, and she had 2 hemophiliac sons. But worse than that, Queen Victoria's youngest daughter, Beatrice, unwittingly passed hemophilia down to Ina, who became Queen of Spain. And in a way, one could say hemophilia also helped bring down the Spanish royals because Queen Ina had 2 hemophiliac sons, both of whom died young, and her husband never ever forgave her. He blamed it on her, of course, as happened when people didn't understand hemophilia or how it was transmitted. And they lost 2 of their sons to hemophilia as well. But certainly I think in terms of the Russian royal family, there might have been quite a different story if Alexei had not been a hemophiliac. The 2 most interesting things that have come through since the discovery of the Romanov remains in the 1990s, and then subsequently in 2007, 2 of the children were missing and they found what was left of them. And so they did very comprehensive DNA testing. And 2 things came out of that. First, that Alexei had type B hemophilia, which could have been perfectly treatable nowadays, of course. And the second most interesting thing, I think, from my point of view as a historian, is that of the 4 girls, only Anastasia was a carrier. And the sad thing was that the elder two girls, who by rights and in royal terms should have been married off by the time they were 18, 20, weren't married off for precisely the reason that the other royal houses of Europe were dreading having haemophilia brought into their families. And of course, if people had known that they weren't carriers, there might have been a different story there. Those two girls could well have been married before the war and escaped being murdered by the Bolsheviks. So that's another big what if, of course. One thing I recently found, and I was very interested to know more, but I couldn't find very much, was that I came across a Victorian article. I think it was written in about 1880 in an American medical journal, which said that there had always been noted that there was a higher incidence of haemophilia in Germany. Now, of course, the Queen Victoria's mother was German from the Saxe-Coburg family, as was Victoria's husband, Prince Albert. So I would love to know if anyone ever uncovers any more evidence or facts about haemophilia coming through somehow from the Saxe-Coburg side. Again, it might have been a spontaneous mutation, but I would love to know about that. My book, The Romanov Sisters, goes into the whole story of the four girls who are very much marginalized. All the attention has always been on Alexei's haemophilia and Rasputin, all the controversy about that. But in fact, those four girls were incredible support to their mother and their brother. They protected him. They watched over him when he's sick, when he had bleeding attacks. They sat by his bedside. And in many ways, Romanov Sisters is a study of the domestic life of the Romanovs. It talks in detail about the 5 pregnancies that Alexandra went through, her fear of haemophilia, and the reaction and the response when Alexei was born, how they dealt with it, how they tried to keep it a secret, how they didn't even tell their very closest relatives, even Nicholas's mother and sisters didn't know for several years. So if you want to read more about how haemophilia impacted on them, it's all in that book. And of course, I've also written on Queen Victoria at various times, and haemophilia impacted also on her family. So you can find out information about all my books, events I'm doing on helenrappaport.com, but also I am on Twitter as Helen Rappaport, I think, and I do post regularly there about all my events, books coming out and stuff. And I have a page, a dedicated page on Facebook, Helen Rappaport Writer.